Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I am your host, John Jewett.
And I am your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Grow your back. Luke and I hit arm training. We figure we give one in honor of back, figure out what to do, what's going on, why is your back not growing. I've made some good improvements this past couple years in my back training, so we can get into the big questions around, does deadlift suck for back? Should you do bent over rows? What about these like really wonky single arm pull downs that, Luke and I look like wussies doing? What are the right exercises and how should you implement them in your program? Should there be ones you should be leaving out? So we'll dive into all these questions, and by the end, you'll have some idea of some things you might implement to get more out of your own back training.
Yeah, and I think just as a brief side note to this is one of the cool things with you prepping this year is you're really seeing that back development difference from the last contest prep to this one. And I think kind of to kick it off, we're going to kind of dive into, slight anatomy, slight action of the back musculature. What are we considering for lats versus upper back? And that would be a good place to start. But I think one of the big things for me, just seeing it anecdotally improve so much for you is what do you think was the big game changer for you across that all season to kind of make the difference? And was it anything revolutionary that you changed, or was it just a better understanding of the things we're going to map out today overall?
I mean, there's a few. Obviously, I wasn't training back ridiculously wrong by any means. It's certain areas of my back were hard to get a connection with, and and probably for you listening out there, you might have body parts where you do a set and the pump is just immediately tremendous.
Yeah.
And other muscle groups are like, man, I have to work so hard to get this area to have some type of pump, which it's not about the pump, but it lets you know something's happening stimulus wise. And that's how at least my lats were. Traps, not as much, but there wasn't enough direct volume there. So I think at least for that body part for me, traps was just making sure there was enough direct volume towards them. And then for lats, it was getting in a position. So it was actually exercise selection and cueing to actually use the lat to its fullest, and especially getting into the lower lat fibers, which I don't have great ability to externally rotate to really get, that hand and elbow tucked in. And so I wouldn't get probably a lot of that lower lat portion. It probably ended up being what some people call upper back based pull downs, which is still lat, of course, but that's when you see the no lat syndrome kind of going on. So from that, it was for me moving to more single arm based movements. Then also I used to, I came from the DC training world, and rack pulls were huge. I came from powerlifting. I love deadlifting. So those were always in place on a back day, and I think they were eating up my volume just from the fatigue standpoint and not making my back better, which once I really have pretty much removed those for quite a while now and been able to put in more volume towards rowing and pulls, which actually is more direct stimulus for what I want for development.
Yeah.
So those are some of the big ones that I would take away, and we'll get, and pretty much all these points there might be some tidbits, and I'll add into those. I think just the frequency of back training was another one too. Kind of understanding where you stand on where you need to dial back on frequency for different body parts and what handles what. So for instance, legs once a week at very low volume. So I can put a lot into back volume to bring it up.
Yeah.
But I know that was a lot. That was a shotgun of a lot of things that we're going to cover. I think we can reel that back into your actual anatomy
function
and basics of back. I realize, for the listening, it's hard to envision some of this stuff, but I think just knowing how a muscle functions lets you give some insight into the exercise choices that are going to cater well around that. So don't worry, we're not going like crazy in depth here, but just the basics.
Yeah. So I think from a conceptual standpoint, I like to break back anatomy into 4 separate categories and understand that these categories have a lot of overlap. So when we talk about back training, like we're going to talk about specific movements that are biased towards something or primarily something, but it doesn't mean that there's other parts of the back not working. It's just when we talk about like adding up volume, especially across like a training program or a training block, differentiating it into like primary movers or primary plane of movement versus secondary plane of movement is how I go about it. So I differentiate lat patterns into 2 separate actions. So we know the primary lats function is going to be that depression of the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint, especially in that vertical plane. So moving into that, from that overhead, kind of down in that plane, very close to the rib cage, really towards the hip. That's where you get the cue of driving it down to the quad or putting it in your pocket. And then also with those lat fibers that wrap around to the thoracolumbar fascia, we're also going to have that extension moment where we're kind of doing that row base pattern with very close to the rib cage. So that would be the first 2. So like vertical plane lat pulling and then horizontal plane lat pulling. The other 2 I break it up into is for like upper back patterns. So vertical pulling for upper back being teres rear delt dominant with some secondary help from like mid traps, with most of our overhand rowing or upper back rowing being very heavily like mid trap, lower trap primarily, with help from teres and lats. So conceptually, I break it into those. There's obviously a lot more you can break that down into depending on plane of elbow, plane of pull, where we're kind of biasing that. But would you kind of say that's a good start for conceptually understanding like the actions, and then probably maybe mapping out like scapular actions within that if needed?
Yeah, I mean, from a macro perspective, like you'll have vertical pulls and horizontal pulls. Like
Yeah.
you'll pretty much encompass a lot of the back musculature and actions around those 2 patterns, your pull downs and your rows. Now, from there, yeah, from the scapular point of view, like you have traps in there, which is a big aspect that you might not get every action done just through pulls and through rows. So, I mean, scapula can work through squeeze the shoulder blades together, down, back, and up elevation, right? That's like this. It's the simple terms, right? Just squeeze them together in up and down patterns. So you have just a normal like standing shrug pattern, or like a Kelso shrug where you're in a row, like a horizontal row, and just squeezing the scapulas together. Which that one's kind of a new one for some people out there doing a Kelso shrug. For a lot of guys, like just doing your horizontal rows is enough for trap development. For those, it might not be, especially like what is fatigue first when you're doing a horizontal row. A lot of times it's like lat, teres, rear delt. Traps can keep going, so that might be an additional way to get some extra stimulus in that type of movement. Then I mean, you would break away into like isolation patterns for, say, the rear delt. Rear delt just, it does attach on the scapula, but primarily just shoulder extension, and more so when we're reaching that, abduction point, like 45 degrees up and higher, it really shines a bit more, I would say. And then the last thing to address in back development, because we're going from the head down to the booty, is spinal erectors.
Yeah.
And everything that's deep beneath them. And I think that's one you kind of forget about, is that there is, and there's a bunch of complicated names that we don't have to get into, but all the thoracic extensors that lie deep under the traps is going to give a lot of depth to the back, but your spinal erectors will give those like that thickness to the lower back, and also tie in to your lats to where you see all that development, and the Christmas tree is there.
Yeah.
With the spinal erectors, main function being spinal extension, which you'll have in your any type of usually hip hinge patterns, 45-degree back raises. I mean, we can talk about bent over rows, things like that, to where you'll be hitting that. So that could be the full encompassment of all the back musculature, which maybe we break it down into actual like 4 or 5 patterns. We could say like a vertical and a horizontal pull, a shrug, maybe a rear delta isolation, and some type of hip hinge-ish pattern.
Yeah.
Through those 5 movements, you could likely encompass most of what the back is going to be doing.
Yeah.
So I'd say if you don't have one of those in your program, you might be missing a point around fully developing your back.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the main point of contention you're going to get there with some people is the hinge, because there are going to be people with the lower back pain that don't tolerate the hinging very well and feel like they could be really missing out on potentially kind of getting that erector development. And I think it's something that you can still develop a very good back without a hinge in play. I think the benefit with some sort of hinge or some sort of pattern where you're supporting yourself within that row, like a bent over row of sorts, is going to be just top to bottom back development, especially when you look at shots like the lat spread and not losing that depth in a lat spread when you get all the way out into that fully spread position. Because you'll see a lot of people, sometimes it's a posing mistake, but sometimes it's just lack of development, is they pull that lat spread and it's like really wide up top and then there's like nothing below it. And it's just really kind of lacking. And you'll often see like a little bit of extra skin there, which looks like not being in condition, but a lot of times it's just lack of development from not being there. So I think that's probably the main point of contention people will typically bring up. I know it's the one that I see a lot of times with back training is, you know, to deadlift or not, and whether you even put that within a back session.
Well, that's one of the big questions here is like, should you even program? Do you need deadlifts to some capacity to have an amazing back? And if you do, then where would you program them? And so what does at least a deadlift pattern, like a conventional deadlift, it leaves a lot of joints kind of at partial ranges of motion and mechanically advantage to lift a heavy load.
Yep.
Like that's how I see the deadlift. Like there's some knee bend, there's some hip bend, and there's a little bit of like, hinging that occurs from that hip bend. So you load a little bit of everything, which allows you to move a lot of weight. So you might not get the full brunt all into like your spinal erectors or your glutes or your quads. But for someone that's earlier on, that might have its place when you need a little bit of everything.
Yep.
But I still lean, if you're hypertrophy based, you're probably better moving to a pattern that can take those muscles that you're trying to target into the fully lengthened position in ranges of motion, and also making the lightest weight hardest possible, which is more bodybuilding related. So with deadlifts as well, you could ask about a sumo deadlift.
Yep.
And that one has even less application when we're talking about back development. Now, your hips are getting really close to the bar. Your torso's more upright, so you're technically going to be loading the spinal erectors less. However, you might be using more load, so you potentially could load the traps more. But again, it's not quite an isometric contraction. There's going to be some movement there. I mean, I know people that when you dead or rack pull or whatever, like traps can get pretty sore. Like it will build some traps, but it's a lot of other muscle groups involved to build some traps. So from those points of view, like it's a lot of fatigue worth like the benefit for bodybuilding.
Yeah.
And so that's when I still like lean into like a stiff leg dead or an RDL or some variation thereof based on your ability to do it. And then also just from what do you need more of, right? So if you need erectors and you need some glute, well, maybe that's the RDL because you're pushing your hips back more. If you need, more hamstring and erectors, then might cater more to an SLDL. So I would lean into those. Like you need, erector development over a conventional deadlift or a sumo deadlift.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I think the other thing I see as where program placing it is an important aspect of it. Outside of the people that run a set schedule and have to run like a back and hamstring session because they're doing that 5-day rotation, so they go like push, pull legs off, push back hams, I really like to keep the hinge as far away from back work as possible. Ideally, having 2 full pull days, so back days at minimum in the rotation, where we're doing all of the other work, the rear delt flies, the pull downs, the rows, the shrug variations of your choice, and then hinging on a separate day, because of even with an SLDR and RDL, the debt that it takes from a session just really kind of limits that volume exposure. And if back's a big priority for an individual, I would much rather push that hinge away from the back work as much as possible.
So what would that look like? Because obviously, if your back is that bad, you're gonna have to scale back in some areas, and back takes a lot of volume. It's going to consume a lot of fatigue as well, or put out a lot of fatigue, I should say. So, I mean, that might be doing legs once a week, then having, you're saying, 2 full pull days, but then you'd have some hinge day. So would you have like hamstring work in that hinge there, or what would be a more ideal scenario? So because that's really like kind of getting some back work in 3 days a week to an extent.
Yeah, so that is the goal, kind of. So it would look like, depending on the split setup, there's 2 split setups I'll cover just to conceptually get 2 points across. So the set split setup, where it's like the 3 days on, 1 day off, 2 days on type of a setup, I'll preferably have like pull push legs. That first leg day will probably have some extra lat work in it. So it'll be like pull, push, lat isolation, or upper back isolation, depending on what they need with the full leg day. They'll have the day off, and then I'll do a pull day with hams and shoulders that has the hinge. So like really kind of cranking that frequency up. That's a pretty high frequency push that I'll do. The other way that I'll do it is, instead of adding that back work to that first leg day, just bring it down to that hamstring shoulder day. But then you're training back 2 days in a row, which is kind of where I try to avoid it. The other variation, which would be like your conventional rotational split setup, whether it's 3 on 1 off or 2 on 1 off, is pull, push, quad focus legs, and then again, pull, push, and that hamstring day has the hinge in it, but it's also got some back work in it as well, because you are going to be needing lats from an isolation standpoint or isometric standpoint to kind of brace throughout that hinge. So I will have some extra back work in that day, but that's when we're starting to get into like the intermediate to advanced athlete that needs a little bit more specialization. And then the further the specialization needs to go, the more that frequency and volumetric just goes up.
Yes, so you mentioned something there, lats and hip hinge. Do you need the hip hinge for your lat development? And no, just like that, I think that's one to like kill right now. Like, you're not going to get huge lats from doing
hinging
any deadlift variation. No. Like we said, the main action, like taking that arm from overhead all the way back down to the hip, the deadlift just doesn't even do that. It just doesn't even make sense. So from a action standpoint, a lat. So it doesn't. But it is need from a stabilize the core. So yes, you need the lat in like a hip hinge, but it's not your primary stimulus for developing.
Yeah,
the lat.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I like the split layouts. I think depending as more advanced you get, like you could have some variation where you do have like leg days once a week. You have, one push session. Your other push session could have a little bit of push, but then have that hip hinge programmed in.
Yep.
Then have 2 pull days.
Yep.
So there's a few different ways to schedule it out, but that's when you your main focus, I really think, has to be back. And for a lot of guys, you might have some other areas that you need to bring up. So just put that in consideration. And also when you're hearing like us talk about these splits, that's for someone that needs a volume level that justifies having 3 days a week, but it also is at a strength level that justifies spreading that fatigue management out too. So consider like what your volume is right now. Like if you're training back once a week, maybe that's 12 sets on a back day. You don't need to go to 25 sets and train it 3 days a week. That might be moving to 14 sets and splitting into 2 days now. So 7 sets on 2 different days. So that's how you kind of escalate that up. So if you're, hey, I want to bring up back, well, start small, make a 20% volume increase maybe that can be done in one session, or it might be, hey, this back session's getting long. I'm starting to get kind of fatigued towards the end, and you spread it out. But typically I would say almost across the board, back is being done twice a week in the majority of my plans, whether you're a newbie or even someone that's advanced up to the point where the back is phenomenal, then that might get dialed back. And I have a few people that is the case where we train back like once a week because their back is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's just simply put, unless you have like a Dorian Yates back, like that twice a week back frequency needs to be there. And most of the time, you're not advanced enough to need the specialization of the like 3 and 4 times per week. But I do think conceptually it's nice to understand that option is there for those extremely elite individuals. Because I even have pros that are professional bodybuilders that aren't running splits that are that specialized, because they're still at the place that it's just more tissue for their class they need. And man, I love specialized training, and I love writing it, and I love discussing it. But the thing I hate about it is people get so honed in on the specialized program, but they throw the quality metric out the window. And they're like, I'm running this back specialization and my back's going to be phenomenal next year. And then their rows look more like a hinge than they do a row. And I think that brings us to like the next point is all the variables that contribute to back development. The execution piece is the most screwed up. And I think you should probably kick that off with your opening comments.
Well, hey, because this gets into it too, because we're talking about, deads, and you should stick maybe with an SLDL or an RDL. What if you can't do that pattern for an injury point of view?
Yeah.
Is there something that can be in its place? And on that note, I would say, like, if you got injured in the past, it's probably it's going to be some work on your end to address like why that happened, and could it be rehab to a point where you could get that back in. Mm-hmm. But at some point maybe it's not worth it, right? And that's what at least I found in a lot of cases for me. Like, it might be a pattern I rotate in and out, but to keep in consistently is where it becomes problematic. Or it might be even something where your hinge is rotated every other week. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do it every week, and maybe that's when you do like a bent over row. Mm-hmm. Like the week after that. So just to put something in your mind out there for those that if you're trying to run it consistently and you get beat up week to week, that you could rotate it every other week with like a bent over row to give yourself a break from it. It's tough to replace that loading for the spinal erectors without loading them really heavy. And there's not really another exercise that does a great job of it. I would say, though, if for some reason you had a back squat in your program, and a back squat where the hips get pretty far away from the bar, mm-hmm. that could probably suffice for enough lower back stimulus if you're responsive to that. Because I've done back squats where I'm like, well, I'm not gonna hip hinge because this is gonna eat me up for the week. So
yep.
But it would go back to the point of like, well, if it's an injury point of view, like, gosh, you probably had just as much risk doing the back squat or doing the hip hinge. And if the back squat's not a problem, likely you're moving into a range that you just don't have control of, or that was a bit excessive. So it's setting that hip hinge up where you're close to where your end range would be. So maybe that is, doing a stiff leg or an RDL on blocks set up high enough, almost kind of like the idea of a rack pull, but in a position that is of an RDL or SLDL, and to where you don't go beyond that range. And also you have a dead stop point that makes that transition from eccentric to concentric a little bit less dynamic.
Yeah.
The only caveat I'll say to that is like, don't bounce off the pins and don't lose your form going down to them either, because you have people that kind of loosen up, then they drive those hips back underneath them to pop it. It's like it's even worse. Like you very well could set yourself up for like an injury just doing it that way. So
I feel the look.
But is there another exercise to sub out, like for lower back development, that you've put in?
Honestly, no. Even the bent over row for me gets a little bit dodgy for most, because just typically the strength level of athlete we're working with, it's almost like the erectors fail before the row fails a lot of times, depending on the athlete. But I think it's the best substitution for not having a hinge in that week. I think of lower back loading in a cup scenario where if you look at 3 different basic patterns, so pressing, squatting, and hinging, you can only fill each of those cups so much. If you're going to squat and hinge in the same program, that pressing has to be way down, just because the load in the shoulder is just going to be so high from the squatting that you probably can't press that much, to the point that most people can't bring their pressing that far down, where you got to choose a squat or a hinge. Otherwise, you're going to be running into issues 6 to 7 weeks down the line. And I just don't see enough erector loading from anything else. Like, the things that start to come to mind would be like back extension, not going to be able to be loaded enough. And it's just not going to be enough erector loading. Some could argue glute ham raise, again, not going to be able to load it enough. So no, I really don't have anything that I would suggest as a substitute.
I mean, you might make a case for like a hip thrust glute bridge. Because, I mean, the pivot point is at the trap. You're loading at the hip. You're going to have to use the erectors. But the main primary thing is going to be the glutes. So I mean, if you couldn't hinge at all, like, you might need that in your plan just as a whole. Some people might bring up like a reverse hyper. Again, it's very glute based. Like, yeah, you have to brace a bit with the erectors, but it's not the same kind of loading you're going to get with doing, an RDL or something. I will say, like, RDL off a picked chart can be pretty forgiving on the lower back, as far as like joint goes, because it kind of lets off a little bit on the bottom.
Yep.
And it keeps pulling you forward a little at the top. That could maybe be an option for somebody.
I was also thinking like a banded pull.
Okay.
It gets pretty aggressive at the top, but it's still not a terrible option for certain people.
I think if you had like some kind of glute ham raise, almost like a not a 45-degree back raise, but something almost nearly horizontal, where you could grab a barbell off the floor and come up to where you get peak tension, like a Superman position. It's like, who has that, right? That might like load short and be like no loading, but it's very suboptimal. So you're kind of in a tough position, because even the guys, like, I've had some guys I've coached that just they can't hip hinge. Like, it's just out of the question. And you see it in like lower back development, even all the way up into their traps, because we talked about those deep muscles that push the traps out to give thickness. Like, it's not there.
Yeah, I agree.
So
yeah, I 100% agree. I think it's something that if you can't do it, trying to fix the root problem to where you can do it is probably the best route to go, if you're willing to go down that little bit of a longer beaten path to get there.
Yeah, I mean, in my particular case, like, because I mentioned, like, I don't do a ton of deadlifting, but I've done so much in my past that, and my spinal erectors have always been at least a bit more of a stronger point, that I didn't need as much of that direct stimulus to them like somebody else would. Yeah. So I am able to do just like bent rows and more braced rowing and pulls, and that wasn't my need for what I needed program wise. So for me, that was like opened up volume to train lats and traps.
Yeah.
But for others, like, if you don't have a lower back and you lack a lot of that thickness, like, it's going to be tough without it.
Yeah, the first 4 years of my bodybuilding, my middle name was Deadlift, so it was just everything I thought about every waking moment.
It's fun.
Oh, it's so much fun.
It's fun. And that's a programming point too, because some people don't need it, but they love it. So it's one of those things where like, maybe there's a workaround in it with, hey, we're going to do one set here. And then you're going to have to go do your other, rowing based stuff after that.
Yeah. I've done like a one set every other week thing for that situation, but I think execution is probably next. Potentially, maybe you argue like setup and then execution, but I think those kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, however we want, we could move muscle group to muscle group. I mean, we could talk about we did the spinal erectors and patterns to pick around that. We could pick the lats, and
I think lats are everybody's favorite. I think we start there, especially with the setup portion, because I'm gonna make the argument there's probably 15% of bodybuilders, physique athletes that can do bilateral lat patterns and get away with it. Maybe 10.
Yeah, it's definitely there. Like, and that's a thing to go back to why we even talked about anatomy, right? Was the lat, to get a lot and focused on it, is to get that elbow, adducted, and that elbow as close to the torso and down to the hip as much as you can. And so for a lot of guys, you do a pull down, that elbow's just flared out because you just don't have access to that range. You don't have the mobility, or you have dysfunction, or whatever it may be. Now, if you're someone that you can keep that elbow tucked in tight and do your rows and do your pull downs, do it. Like, for one, time efficiency is awesome with it. It sucks having to, do a single arm pattern, and doubles the time of it. Another thing to consider around bilateral is that your torso is just kind of swinging around in space, and with the single arm pattern, getting stronger, for one, you kind of use less load in a sense, but you're able to brace a bit with the other arm. Mm-hmm. So it can have an advantage around that too. But you're right. I think for the majority of people that I've coached, especially those that don't have a lot of lat, moving to single arm patterns that can allow you to get that elbow tucked in as tight as possible, you get a lot more lat out of.
Yeah. I think even when you go to single arm, the setup and execution is still so important, because I love our people that follow our content, and you guys are unbelievable with the posts that you guys tag me in. But I get the single arm pull down tag that it starts here, overhand, externally rotated, and then it pulls down that rear delt, and the elbow ends there. And it's like, look, I'm doing the single arm lat pull down. I'm like, brother, you're doing a rear delt pull down more than you're doing a lat pull down. But I think the cueing is important, because it's easy, so easy to let it go into, especially if you're upper back dominant, to like tearage rear delt plane. And it's such a minor like difference in cueing, because everybody thinks train back, pull back, when in reality for all those lat patterns, it's almost like out and in front feeling, and then down to the top of the quad when we talk about cueing those patterns.
Yeah, and so like the movement choice around that, to give everyone some framework of selection here, is like, usually everybody is going to have a pull down to some degree.
Yeah.
So like the D handle sitting offset on the pull down, and keeping that elbow pointing towards the ground pretty much the whole time. Because once that elbow starts pointing out towards the wall or more, that's usually how you start the pull and end the pull. So like for Luke and I, what we're trying to cue is elbow always stays facing the ground, and you drive it down into the ground and tuck it hard into that hip. So with that D handle, you can scoot over so the shoulder will line up right underneath that handle, and lean back as much as you need before you'd see that arm that goes directly overhead and the elbow starts pointing out towards the wall. So I usually have everyone kind of leaning back in that pull down, maybe 15, 20 degrees, depending on how the station is set up.
Agreed.
Now, maybe you have a really shitty pull down, and you're like, man, I fall off the bench if I go over anymore. There, you might be able to kneel beside it. And I know people give some shit on that from bracing, but man, for a single arm pattern, you're not using a lot of load anyway. Certain ones can work okay with a 25-pound plate underneath the foot.
Yeah.
that can bring you up to the thigh pad. The hip is pushed against the side of the seat, so you have like 3 points of contact still, and then that other arm can grab the thigh pad, so you can be relatively pretty braced. Another option that I'm just not a fan of as much is doing a moving the incline bench between the cable crossovers and setting up the pull down there. That one seems to lack the most bracing, at least that I've used. And usually the pulley's in the middle of the bench, so you still have this issue where the elbow can trail off unless you're moving your bench every time.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think those are the primary ones when we talk about like lat patterns. I think you could start to go into lat rows and pullovers, because I think the pullover is just an expression of that vertical plane movement that you could really train a lengthened lat position with stepping away from the cable, keeping that elbow tucked and facing the ground, preferably potentially with a cuff so that you can kind of let that hand go all the way, and leaning over a bit. I really like that for like the end of sessions, because for a lot of people, getting to that lengthened extreme end range brings in the lack of external rotation exposure, and they really start to kind of go into that position where like a cuffed pullover stepped back away from the cable just a smidge, where they can lean over and that hand is under the pulley now, and that's kind of like that step back for the lean over is really good position to train a lengthened lat, but that's going to be a very isolated pattern towards the end of the session. And then single arm rowing, which is one that both of us love, I think is the
but before the row, like what about like the pullover machines? Because some people like still get along with these things.
I just don't. I don't see it. First, you're kind of stuck in a bilateral pattern, which again is going to be an issue for 90% of bodybuilders just from being able to get into the position. And then the loading is just not quite where I would want it for a lat, because of that position not being very aligned well for most, it just turns into a lot of teres loading at the top, and I don't think you're starting very well into a lat pattern with those pullover machines.
Is that a bad thing? Like, say you I need more teres and upper lat, and that's going to load it lengthen, which you don't get a lot of in other movements.
Would be ideal, I think.
What if, how close would it matter? Like if you had that elbow pointed a bit out towards the wall, but enough, right? And you're like, man, Luke, I do these and I feel like my arms are resting, at 90 degrees now, like I'm wide as a door.
If you're like subjectively getting that much of a pump, then send it. Like, that's cool.
All right on. Okay.
Just understand the goal for lat is not going to be the greatest when it comes to especially mid to lower lat fibers. And I would argue you could potentially set up the cable a bit better.
Okay. Yeah, no, fair enough. I think some people are going to ask this because that's the Dorian
classic
pullover, man. And we have that one in the gym, and like it can be okay. The only thing is like you got a seatbelt in and how you're setting it up. I think I've used it before, and the problem is like where the pivot point is and where in relation to where my elbow has to rest in the pad. For one, I can't grab onto it with my hands. You feel a lot of tricep and elbow starts getting into it. So it's a tough one to get in and like really have it connect well. I've seen some guys try to get in it like single arm and twist around into it, and like, man, just go to the cables, man.
Yeah, I think the lengthened position in that machine really concerns me. It feels really dodgy, is why I've always kind of just nope, fuck this, and kind of go on.
Yeah, I mean, with the pull downs, how we set them up, I mean, you get hit pretty hard mid-range. Now, I'd say in back in general, we don't get a lot of patterns where you load it fully stretched, where you get potentially the most ability for like good output and stimulus for growth. But there are some machines out there that are awesome pull-down machines for the lat. The Nautilus pull-down is a solid piece if you have access to that one. That one is set up really well to, for one, do unilateral patterns, but also the curve on it, it loads pretty heavy lengthen.
Yep.
And kind of drops off towards the bottom, which is like ideally what you would want for that. Some people use the hammer strength high row, which doesn't load like that. It's actually the opposite.
Yep.
However, it is machine based. That could be an option in the arsenal if you don't have a lot and that's just all you got. Have you used any other like pull down base machines that are?
I have a client who loves the Prime one, the new Prime version of the Nautilus. But
okay, I haven't used that one.
I can't speak to it mechanically because I haven't seen how the load rotates on it. He just sent a video of like cutting the back half of the machine off and him doing the pull down. And I was like, okay, it looks great plane wise, but I can't tell how it's loading because I can't see the cam on the back end. So I'd have to look at it and go see kind of how it loads. But from a plane perspective, it looks phenomenal.
Yeah, well, anyway, those are some machine options. I think from there, rowing, which...
Oh, yeah. Lat rowing.
Lat rowing is the same issue with doing pull downs for lats, is that we see a lot of guys, the elbow starts just drifting off and becoming a bit more into the upper back, especially like single arm dumbbell work, right? It's a rotational movement and it's a lot of momentum. You get a lot of movement from the obliques, and then it's like a little bit of row at the end. So, bracing in a single arm row is going to be really important. So you are only primarily moving at the shoulder joint. Some scap movement's fine, but just remember the lat doesn't attach onto the scapula, so that's not the main cueing point in these. But most people are going to have like a seated cable row, which getting into a single arm cable row pattern, when you have that cable, usually it's in the middle, sit offset to it a little bit to where when you look down at that cable, it would draw a line straight up to the hip. That's kind of where you want to position that, and have it to when if someone was to look directly behind you, that cable would run through the hand, the elbow, and the shoulder.
Yep. And
so when you're rowing, you're driving, you're cueing that elbow down and almost dragging up the quad, scraping the ground, and ending with that elbow at the hip and squeezing in hard. Now, if you drive that hip way past the torso, that's not the lat's job. If you get past a little bit, that's okay. But I think that leads someone into territory, if you don't have a lot of lat and that's your issue, that you might, as you fatigue, get back into pulling that elbow out towards the wall and externally rotating. So I would just make sure you keep that tension on the lat. As far as how much like lateral lean to do is going to depend how much external rotation or lack thereof you have. I see some people, it drives me nuts, is like, all right, I'm doing the single arm row. And they're like just turned like so much lateral flexion and also cervical flexion. Like they're like trying to look up a girl's dress doing a row. It's like, why are you doing it that way? It's just like, well, that's, I think, how you're supposed to do it. It's like, no, it's just enough to get the elbow pretty close to the torso.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's all you need to do. Some people that's going to be more, some people that's going to be less, but that's the gist of the more of a lat focused row.
Yeah. And I think to me, the best piece for it is the single arm Nautilus Explode row and or the other variations that are made. I know Gym Shop makes one and there's a couple other ones, but length and loading, adjustable handle, rotational handle. You can drive the handle down. Just, you can't beat it. It's literally the best option. You can finagle it on like a single arm hammer strength row and a couple others, but they just all don't like ideally line up the best or the bracing shit.
That's what I've been using, the hammer strength isolateral row.
Yeah. And
like sitting back.
Yeah.
And then it diverges. So I like sit kind of like counterclockwise out.
Yeah.
And it's fine. And it does let off a lot towards the top when you set back far enough. And also the elbow drops down as you pass over that pivot point, which kind of cues elbow down. But it's not like the best option, but it can work.
Yeah, it definitely gets the job done.
Don't do that one bilateral.
Oh my God,
it's like
no.
The worst one I see done bilateral. It turns into basically like this like hammer curl, pseudo row. So it's a little bit too narrow for almost everyone.
Yeah.
And it's diverging, so it's not going to be the best for Latin. And when I say diverging, what I mean, everybody, is that as you row, the handles are spreading apart.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I think that is kind of like a few of your lat based rows. If you don't have a lot of equipment, like back in COVID days, I was doing a single arm like landmine row, standing next to it, which that can work. It and the profile is pretty good because it loads LinkedIn and lets off a bit as you row up. Again, it's bracing was more of the issue with it because you're trying to hang on to something. Hang on to something with the other hand, and so it becomes challenging. So it's that one you'd move to the end of the session where like you're not going to use a lot of load anyway.
Yeah,
but
it's tough to get far enough back to for some people to get the elbow or shoulder depressed, right? It's one where I see a lot of people pull it into that rear delt and kind of start letting that elbow flare.
We had this little like it was like a 4-foot bar at the gym that I was using because
so it kicks back fast on you.
Yeah. So it kicks back fast, which is ideal. Like a full length Olympic bar, like you're not getting a lot of like that drop off, and also doesn't rotate down enough. Yeah. So yeah, you're either sacrificing the LinkedIn or the shorten. So
one of the two.
Not ideal, but it works, Or hell, if you just got dumbbells, do your single arm dumbbell row. But the idea is to brace the torso well and make sure you understand where that elbow should be finishing.
Yeah, I agree. And then, excuse me, I think overhand rowing.
Yeah.
To me, there's like 3 pieces that are really hard to beat. It's an overhand chest supported T-bar row.
Yes.
The overhand prime extreme row. And then in a solid third place, because the handles are too narrow, is the overhand prime horizontal row. Because it's great for loading a LinkedIn position, but as you pull back, the handles don't separate far enough for me, and it kind of gets a little bicep-y. So top 3, can't beat it. No questions asked, without a doubt.
Yeah, queuing on these guys when you want a thick ass upper back, right? And this truly for me, I feel like that was a game changer in my programming, was getting the prime extreme row, because load most of the load on that top peg, which loads it heavy on the LinkedIn. You don't get that any other rowing pattern for the most part, to the extent the prime can do it. So I usually have like 60-70% of load up top and the rest in the middle peg. So that might be, it's for me, it's like 3 plates and a quarter on the top, 2 plates in the middle peg.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And load like that, because you're going to load that stretch position and then let off towards the top when it's harder to finish off the row. But cueing wise on these, the idea is to get a lot of range of motion, and we want to bring in those thoracic extensors. So, but when you're starting the movement, you want the upper back rounded over a little bit and a little bit of cervical flexion. And that's going to allow you, because the idea here is also trap. So you want those scapulas to wrap around the rib cage and elevate some. Then as you row, you're driving the elbows back, bringing the chest up and squeezing hard on the scapulas together and down. So at the top, you should look like now the head is thrown back, the chest is up, and you have fully squeezed the scaps. So that's how you can get like the full range out of all that upper back musculature. And I would say don't let those elbows stay out at 9 degrees. And a test you can do is like, as you're sitting there, like flare out your elbows right at 9 degrees. And when you pull back, for some, you might feel like, man, that's kind of uncomfortable in my rotator cuff. But you'll hit a stop point. Drop them right below that, maybe like not even 10 degrees below that, and then retract more. And you'll notice your elbows can go back even farther. Mm-hmm. That's where you're able to get more range out of the rear delt, more range out of the trap. And full range is what we want out of these movements. So you shouldn't be doing these rows at full 90 degrees, but just right below it to where you can get that full shoulder extension and get those traps fully retracted and squeezed back.
Would you argue on the extension moment, you're not taking it past letting the sternum come off the pad?
Yeah. Yeah, like keep that, of course, keep the chest brace there. But otherwise, you're going to feel like a lot of lower back loading. So what I try to cue when I like set up my brace in it is I drive the pelvis into the bench or whatever you're set up on, right? Even the T-bar row. So I almost have a little bit of almost lumbar flexion to where it makes it very challenging to want to use the lumbar as part of it to extend the spine. And this just let your sternum sit heavy on the bench. So, a little bit's going to be okay. But again, you can get carried away with it to where you can now turn this into a bent over row. So don't want to go that far.
Yeah. That's a good place to add a Kelso shrug. So from a programming perspective, row to failure, and then do the Kelso shrug.
Yeah.
Just
once you reach the failure point, right, just all you're doing now is squeezing the scaps together and finishing them off. It might just be another 5-6 reps you get, but again, that's 5-6 RIR away from proximity to failure that you're at for traps. If you need traps, take them all the way. That's an easy way, time-efficient way to get some extra volume in for that muscle group.
Very much so.
And I know we're coming up on like an hour here on this, but I think on that point is an actual shrug pattern. Like it, and for a lot of guys, rows will be plenty along with the hip hinge. For some, that might not be enough. I have been doing a shrug, just like 2 sets once a week on one of these days. And Kelso shrugs have been in and out. But at least for my shrugs, I've been using dumbbells and keeping just the slightest bit of hip hinge. It's almost like a shrug row that I've been doing.
Yeah.
So I kind of allow some thoracic flexion to happen and then driving the scapulas kind of up and back. So you don't just hit like the upper trap, but some of that mid trap too. That's how I at least been doing them. I know if you had like a prime or even a free motion dual cable stack where you could set your arms up like out 30 degrees from the body, that would line up really well with the trap fibers. But it's hard. I just don't have access to that. So
yeah.
And even having set up to where it's like a little bit in front of you, that would probably be ideal. But most people might not have that. So dumbbells still are like a really good option. Barbell, I'd say, is not as much just because it keeps you very internally rotated, which it moves that shoulder in front of the body to where you're going to line up like very top of the upper trap, or even you're going to be using a lot of like sternocleidomastoid like to elevate with.
Yeah.
Which, ideally when we're looking at our shots, like for a rear double or rear lat spread, it's really, we're trying to highlight more of that mid upper trap area. So that's and with the shrug too, control them, like bring them up, squeeze, and do on all these movements, all these back movements. The big issue I see is that there's lack of eccentric control. So do a 3-second count to let them out on every row pattern, every pull down that you do, because that's where you end up having a lot of guys just using momentum. It's just the concentric that they're controlling, and then they lose it on the eccentric, and that is the money part of the rep. And that's what makes back training so different, is that you don't have to have that portion of it like you do like on a bench press where you're controlling down the bar, or a squat, you having to really control down the bar. So if you do that on your rows and your pull downs, man, you'll get some more out of it.
Yeah, and it'll just almost double that volume metric you're at because you're missing out on half the rep, and I think that's such a value add.
You're right, and like even then, you might have to cut back your volume because it'll become that much more stimulating.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's kind of like the back work that Kyle's a recent one that we've put up where the back double change was just massive. Like his overall training volume across the week wasn't really that much more. It was just that quality was so much higher, especially from an eccentric standpoint, that it just like made a massive difference in the total stimulus per week that he was getting.
Yeah, I remember Dante Trudell, like in a long time ago. He's like just he always put emphasis in the rowing and pull down, like to emphasize the stretch in your pull downs. Which there's a point to that, right? Like people don't spend enough time, like for one, controlling the eccentric, but also allowing themselves to get fully lengthened and stretch. Mm-hmm. And like, that's like the money part of that rep for your pull downs and rows. So have that slight pause in that, eccentric starch position and initiate with the back, and don't let momentum generate that initial movement. Because that initial movement, when that muscle's fully stretched, is like the money part of the rep, that whole phase. So if you let momentum generate it, like you're losing out on a lot of quality stimulus for growth, especially when back is your struggle point here.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So the last piece, wide grip, pull down, and then call it.
Yeah. So for upper back too. We could call this an upper back pull down. I mean, people get all up in arms about what you're calling things, but basically, like where the elbows are finishing, it does determine a bit more of what's going to be put emphasis on in the back, which the normal pull down people do. It doesn't get a lot of lower lat involved. It gets some lat, a lot of teres, some mid lower trap, rear delt, and so that's what the point of this one is it's to have more of that kind of mid cross the back development. And so with an upper back biased pull down, we're still looking to keep someone tilted back 15 to 20 degrees, so arms are out in front of them, and a width of grip that allows you to get fully retracted. And that, for most people, is going to be a little bit wider than shoulder width. So like going wider than that, you're only limiting your range of motion, usually off the front end. And so what I look for when I set it up is like when someone gets fully retracted and pulled down, that I see the elbow is stacked with the wrist.
Yep.
And so that should be in line. And also we're allowing that torso to not move back and forth. That is key, guys. This is not going to be a lower back exercise. So I don't want to see someone come fully upright and then swing back into position. That is momentum. You are now losing tension for what you can generate with the teres, the lats, the traps, and all that. Just what I just talked about, the money part of the rep. So stay locked in, leaning back, drive the elbow back, and as you're driving back, you can bring the chest up some and really focus on retracting the scapulas back and down. Then let it out with control and allow those scapulas to wrap around the back as you get fully stretched out. And you can have a little bit of thoracic flexion at the top. So it's kind of like your row we just talked about, where there's going to be some thoracic movement, but locking the lumbar in, locking in the lower back.
Yeah, and I think the amount that you lean back is just the implement you use, because a wide grip bar might need a little bit more lean back than an adjustable handle one where you can rotate the D handles to account for that lean back.
And so to put this structure, and there's lots of ways to structure it, and typically go off of like complexity of the list, the how much fatigue it might generate, then also around the need. Mm-hmm. Typically how I would order this would be a lat based pull down. I'd then like an upper back biased row into a lat based row, then back into, usually it's rear delt work and then trap work. And then usually we're putting our hip hinge on another day. Do you structure it differently at all?
No, not really.
You might argue shifting the upper back row.
Yeah,
after the lat row, but I guess my point of argument is that it gives some break of the lat for output
purposes
when you move to when you have the other row in place. For
someone who has like very lacking lats relative to upper back, I do write a session that would be like single arm pull down, lengthened position lat row, like the extreme row if they have it, the Nautilus extreme row, Y grip pull down, lat base cable pullover. And then I just have an overhand row on the other day. But that's like really lat specific session.
Yeah, I think doing 2 sessions like that makes a lot of sense, to where you can rotate them through and have different. Make sure you're fully developing each side, not putting too much emphasis on one. Typically, you don't see some guy that's like super lat heavy without trap, but you see the guy that's like very trap heavy with no lats.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense to always have the pull down first in nearly every instance that I can think of.
I would agree. Yeah, 100%.
But I think that was a lot. So we'll wrap it up there, guys. Again, like, if you want to learn more about this cueing, and hey, this is great that we talk about it, John and Luke, but we could use visuals. And that's why Luke and I created like the Applied Hypertrophy Optimization course. So we both take you into the gym. We look exactly how we laid this out. Anatomy, function of each body part. How do you line someone up in these machines? What are the cues to do? We look at pros and cons to each of the machines and help you structure out your workout, and so we can get the most out of every rep. So check that out. It's on j3university.com. We have that course there for you. It'll fast track you to get you more out of every rep that you do in the gym. But any questions or anything, comments, leave them below, and we will talk to you next time.